What starts as a routine noise complaint quickly spirals into chaos, with shouting, physical resistance, and accusations flying. In the blink of an eye, a backyard scene becomes a tense standoff, an arrest struggle, and a courtroom-worthy case of mistrust and conflict. The incident begins in the backyard of a residential property, where officers respond to a call. The atmosphere is tense from the start. The officers approach cautiously, heading toward the back corner of the yard. Voices can be heard before the officers arrive, and the individuals on scene appear confused and defensive. The officers begin by asking plainly, "What's going on?" but are met with resistance. One of the individuals repeatedly insists, "Nothing happened," while others murmur among themselves. The officers attempt to gain control over the situation, instructing the people present to turn and let me see your hands. This request quickly escalates tensions. There are refusals, confusion, and questions thrown back at them. The officers direct individuals to come over here after claiming someone called them. One person responds, "Please help. I need to stay here," while another insists, "Yeah, you stay here." Why? This back and forth shows an atmosphere of misunderstanding and mistrust between both parties. The officer's tone grows more insistent. Sit down on the ground," they command. This causes further agitation. Voices rise, and repeated questions such as, "What's going on?" indicate a breakdown in communication. The officers explain that they are responding to a noise complaint. However, the individuals involved continue to deny that anything happened. Arguments begin to overlap as the officers attempt to gain compliance. At this stage, confusion deepens. One of the individuals claims someone called to say there was noise, while the officers insist they have the authority to investigate. "They can't come in," one officer says, referring to the property. Another states, "They don't got a warrant," highlighting the legal boundaries. But there is no de-escalation. Instead, voices become louder, and the scene turns increasingly chaotic. A key moment occurs when one officer attempts to open the door to investigate. This is met with resistance. Individuals shout, "No, nobody called. I'm here for you," and open the door, while officers repeat their commands. The lack of agreement fuels further hostility. Someone says, "Don't push me," while another asks, "Why are you under arrest?" This marks a turning point where verbal disagreement turns into physical confrontation. Officers begin trying to restrain individuals. "Stay back, get your friend," they shout, but the crowd resists. The language becomes aggressive, with repeated statements like "Stop resisting" echoing through the scene. Individuals refuse to comply, saying, "I'm not touching you," and "Don't touch me," while officers continue to instruct them to put your hands behind your back. This back and forth exemplifies the breakdown in communication, with both sides growing increasingly frustrated. Bystanders start reacting strongly, yelling at officers, "You don't need 3 officers for one girl, and you'll be doing too much." The officers respond by insisting they are following procedure. There is a chorus of shouting, accusations, and demands. Some individuals ask why multiple officers are required, while officers continue to repeat commands to control the situation. The tension continues to build as one individual, later identified as Perez, begins actively resisting. She pushes back against officers and verbally challenges them. She repeatedly tells them not to touch her, saying, "You got a camera, I'm not touching you." The officers maintain their stance, instructing her to follow their commands. The exchange becomes louder, with several people speaking at once, making it difficult to maintain control of the scene. At one point, officers warn that they will arrest individuals if compliance is not given. They say, "Back up," or "You want to go with her," and stop resisting. However, Perez continues to resist physically and verbally, insisting she is being treated unfairly. Her defiance draws more attention from those nearby, adding fuel to the chaotic atmosphere. The verbal confrontation now turns physical, with officers attempting to gain control while maintaining the safety of everyone involved. They continue to issue orders, "Put your hands behind your back," but these are met with refusals and louder protests. The situation grows tense enough that more officers arrive on scene to assist. The arrival of additional officers does not calm the situation. Instead, it adds to the perception of escalation for the individuals involved. Voices rise further. Accusations are exchanged, and officers are repeatedly told they are overreacting. Bystanders yell, "Stop touching me and you'll be doing too much." This exchange exemplifies a deep mistrust between civilians and law enforcement. The scene becomes a cycle of commands, refusals, and resistance, with no party willing to step down. By the end of this section, what began as a noise complaint has evolved into a full-scale confrontation. The yard is filled with shouting, physical restraint attempts, and confusion. Officers are trying to establish control, but resistance and accusations create an environment of chaos. The initial encounter has set the stage for what will become a prolonged and intense arrest process, marked by a continued verbal and physical conflict. It begins with the confrontation shifting into full physical resistance. By this point, officers have made contact with the individuals in the backyard and are attempting to detain them, but one individual, later identified as Perez, refuses to comply. Her defiance escalates tensions further. This section captures the intensity of the arrest, the resistance of Perez, and the increasingly chaotic interaction between police and civilians. The moment begins with officers attempting to secure Perez's compliance. Commands are issued repeatedly. Put your hands behind your back, stop resisting, and back up. Perez does not follow these commands. Instead, she verbally insists, "I'm not resisting," while physically pulling away from the officers. The repetition of these words contrasts sharply with her actions, which are clearly resistant. She pushes and struggles against the officers, insisting, "Don't touch me, and I'm not touching you." This constant back and forth illustrates a fundamental breakdown in communication. Both sides believe they are correct, and neither backs down. The officers insist that compliance is necessary for safety and procedure. "Put your hands behind your back," they repeat, explaining they need to detain her. However, Perez continues to physically resist, which leads the officers to escalate their restraint techniques. They attempt to secure her arms, but she pulls away repeatedly, shouting accusations that they are using excessive force. Her words, "You, Don T, need 3 officers for 1 girl," capture the perception of disproportionate force that she and bystanders express throughout the encounter. As the struggle continues, voices around the scene grow louder. Bystanders shout at officers, some trying to intervene verbally. "You'll be doing too much. Why are you under arrest? Stop bumping me." This chaotic crowd dynamic makes the arrest more difficult. Officers must balance securing Perez while controlling the surrounding crowd. They call for backup repeatedly and more officers arrive, increasing the tension rather than calming it. Perez continues to resist physically. She pulls her arms away, refuses to comply with handcuff orders, and verbally challenges the officers. "You're hurting me. Why are you putting my arm like that?" These statements reflect both her resistance and her claim that the officers are using excessive force. Officers respond with repeated commands to stop resisting and warnings that continued resistance will lead to further charges. This dynamic illustrates a common pattern in such encounters. Verbal defiance paired with physical resistance that the police interpret as justification for force. At this point, other individuals on scene, including bystanders and possibly family members, add to the tension. Voices overlap, some defending Perez and questioning the officer's actions. "You're locking me up for some push," one individual yells. Others demand explanations. "Why are you running me?" This chorus of voices creates confusion and raises the stakes of the arrest. Officers now face not only the resistance of Perez, but also a growing crowd questioning their actions. Officers attempt to maintain control by separating Perez from others. They instruct her, "Stay back, and put your hands behind your back." Perez responds with louder defiance. Her resistance is both verbal and physical. She continues to pull away, shout, and accuse officers of wrongdoing. This resistance prolongs the struggle, with officers needing to apply greater force to secure her safely. Each refusal to comply is met with a firmer physical response from officers, escalating the incident further. The scene grows even more intense when Perez's resistance involves pushing and shoving. Officers call for calm, but she continues to argue loudly. "Stop touching me," she repeats, while officers insist she is resisting. This part of the encounter highlights the fine line between perceived and actual resistance. Perez insists she is not resisting, yet the physical struggle clearly shows otherwise. The officers interpret her movements as active defiance, which justifies a stronger use of restraint under standard arrest protocols. Amid the struggle, officers attempt to explain the reason for arrest. However, Perez does not engage in meaningful dialogue. Instead, she continues to challenge the officer's authority, asking, "Why are you putting my arm like that? And what the heck?" Her verbal protests blend with physical resistance, creating an environment where clear communication is nearly impossible. This dynamic is important because it shows how resistance arrests can escalate rapidly when both sides feel threatened and misunderstood. The bystanders' involvement complicates matters further. Some attempt to mediate, others challenge the officer's actions. "You don't need 3 officers for 1 girl," one voice shouts repeatedly. This creates an environment of public scrutiny and verbal pressure on the officers. They respond by insisting they are following procedure and that compliance is necessary for everyone's safety. However, the verbal crowd and physical resistance make the situation highly volatile. Eventually, after sustained resistance, officers succeed in restraining Perez. She is handcuffed, but not without continued shouting and protest. Even as she is placed under control, she insists she has done nothing wrong, saying, "I'm not resisting and you're hurting me." Officers repeat that she is being taken into custody for resisting arrest and assault. Perez's continued verbal resistance illustrates the deep tension and mistrust present throughout the encounter. By the end of Section 2, the situation has shifted from a verbal confrontation to an active physical arrest. Perez is now in custody, but the scene remains loud and chaotic. Voices still shout, orders are still given, and officers prepare to transport her to the station. This section highlights the challenges of arresting a resisting suspect, the escalation of force, the difficulty in communication, and the influence of surrounding. Section 3 begins after Perez has been restrained and handcuffed. Following a prolonged and chaotic confrontation in the backyard, while the officers have succeeded in subduing her, the conflict is far from over. This section focuses on what happens during her transport to the police station and the ongoing verbal and physical resistance that continues even after the initial arrest. Once Perez is restrained, officers attempt to escort her to the patrol car. This is a tense process. Perez continues to protest loudly, insisting repeatedly, "I'm not resisting and you're hurting me." She questions why she is being taken into custody, asking, "Why are you putting my arm like that? And why are you trying to lock me up out of nowhere?" These statements reflect both her continued resistance and her claim that the arrest is unjustified. The officers, however, maintain that she is under arrest for resisting and assault. The interaction during transport is chaotic. Perez continues to verbally challenge the officers, questioning every action. She shouts, "I just pushed you, but I didn't do anything wrong," and repeatedly asks why 3 officers were involved in restraining her. These comments highlight her perception of excessive force and lack of proportionality in the arrest. Bystanders in the area continue to shout, adding to the confusion and tension. Officers attempt to explain the charges and the need for compliance. They insist that her resistance during the arrest justified their actions and that she must cooperate to avoid further charges. However, Perez refuses to engage calmly, instead continuing to yell and resist physically, even while inside the patrol car. She struggles against the handcuffs, saying, "Don't pull my arm like that, and I'm not resisting," despite the clear physical resistance she is offering. The arrival of her sister, later identified as Sanchez, escalates the situation further. Sanchez intervenes vocally, questioning the officers and demanding to know why Perez is being arrested. "You locking me up for some push?" she asks, challenging the officers' authority. This intervention draws more attention from bystanders, creating a larger crowd dynamic that adds to the intensity of the encounter. Sanchez herself refuses to cooperate, yelling at officers and physically resisting their attempts to control her. The officers faced multiple challenges during transport. They must ensure Perez is secure, deal with Sanchez's interference, and manage the crowd's reactions. Officers repeatedly call for compliance, saying, "Stop resisting and let's go," but these commands are met with continued verbal defiance. Perez continues to shout, "You don't know what I am going to do and why would you want to lock me up?" Her resistance is both emotional and physical, creating a sustained confrontation during the transport process. Inside the patrol car, Perez remains loud and combative. She questions the legality of the arrest and repeatedly challenges the officer's conduct. Her tone suggests she feels targeted and treated unfairly. Sanchez joins her in protest, arguing loudly and questioning the officer's actions. The verbal exchanges grow more heated, with both sisters making repeated accusations of misconduct. This creates an environment of mutual hostility, where neither side is willing to de-escalate. Officers attempt to maintain order by clearly explaining the charges and reminding the detainees of their rights. They state that Perez is being charged with resisting arrest and assault, and that Sanchez is being charged with disorderly conduct and obstruction. However, these explanations do little to calm the situation. Both women continue to loudly dispute the officer's claims, creating a tense atmosphere during transport. The crowd outside continues to react. Voices call out from nearby, some urging the officers to calm the situation, others defending Perez and Sanchez. "Why all be doing too much and stop touching me" are repeated phrases heard during the exchange. This outside pressure adds another layer of difficulty for the officers, who must balance controlling the individuals in custody with managing the public scene. The transport becomes a prolonged struggle of words, resistance, and loud exchanges. By the time the patrol vehicle arrives at the station, the conflict remains unresolved. Perez and Sanchez are still vocal and resistant. Officers attempt to escort them inside, but both continue to verbally challenge the officer's authority and decisions. Perez insists she has done nothing wrong, while Sanchez loudly demands explanations. This interaction demonstrates that even after physical restraint, verbal resistance and mistrust of authority can persist. Once inside the station, officers work to secure both women for processing. Perez continues to argue and resist, claiming she is being treated unfairly. She tells the officers, "You're hurting me and I'm not resisting." Sanchez also remains defiant, questioning the legitimacy of her sister's arrest and continuing to refuse cooperation. The noise level inside the station is high, with shouting and protests continuing until officers complete the booking process. This section highlights how the arrest process did not end at the scene but continued through transport and into the station. The verbal and physical conflict persisted, fueled by perceptions of excessive force, mistrust, and refusal to comply. Officers remained focused on maintaining control and completing the arrest, while Perez and Sanchez maintained their resistance and vocal protests. This dynamic demonstrates how arrests involving resistance rarely end quietly, and how emotions and distrust can extend beyond the initial confrontation. By the end of Section 3, the physical arrest has been carried out, but the conflict continues. The transport to the station becomes an extension of the initial struggle, filled with shouting, resistance, and verbal disputes. The scene remains tense, with both detainees and officers unwilling to yield. This sets the stage for Section 4, where the formal charges are announced and the aftermath of the incident is documented. Section 4 begins after the chaotic transport to the police station. By this point, both Perez and Sanchez have been brought into custody, but the incident is far from over. This section covers the formal processing of the suspects, the continued verbal conflict, the charging decisions, and the aftermath of the incident. Once inside the station, officers escort Perez and Sanchez into the booking area. Despite being restrained in handcuffs, Perez continues to resist verbally. She loudly protests, "I'm not resisting, you're hurting me, and why are you locking me up?" Her tone is defiant, and her body language suggests frustration and disbelief. Sanchez echoes similar sentiments, questioning why her sister has been detained and insisting that the officer's actions are unjustified. Both sisters maintain a combative tone throughout the process, making the booking procedure a prolonged, intense affair. Inside the station, officers attempt to calm the situation. They repeat their reasons for the arrest, explaining that Perez resisted arrest and assaulted an officer during the altercation in the backyard, while Sanchez obstructed the administration of law and engaged in disorderly conduct. The officers attempt to explain these charges, but the detainees respond with loud denials. Perez claims she just pushed the officer and insists this does not justify her arrest. Sanchez challenges the officers, repeatedly asking, "Why are you locking me up? And what did she do wrong?" These exchanges show the continuing lack of agreement over the legitimacy of the arrest. The process of securing both detainees is not straightforward. Officers work to adjust handcuffs, ensure compliance with search procedures, and maintain order inside the station. Perez and Sanchez resist these efforts verbally, questioning every action. Perez says, "You're pulling my arm too hard," while Sanchez argues, "I don't have nothing, why are you locking us up?" These objections are punctuated by loud shouting, creating a chaotic atmosphere in the booking area. Officers repeat commands to sit down and calm down, but both detainees continue their vocal protests. During processing, Perez continues to insist she was treated unfairly and demands explanations for her arrest. Her tone is both defiant and frustrated, reflecting the emotional intensity of the encounter. Sanchez likewise remains vocal, loudly stating that she believes her sister was wrongly arrested. She engages with officers directly, questioning their actions and the need for additional force. This verbal resistance is a continuation of the conflict that began at the scene, showing that even after restraint, mistrust and defiance can persist. The officers maintain a professional stance, focusing on completing the booking process. They explain that Perez is being charged with assault, throwing bodily fluids, resisting arrest, and aggravated assault. Sanchez is charged with disorderly conduct, obstruction of the administration of law, and resisting arrest. These charges reflect both the physical resistance observed at the scene and the behavior of the detainees during transport and processing. Officers emphasize that their actions followed protocol given the resistance they faced. Despite these explanations, both detainees remain confrontational. Perez continues to argue that her arrest is unjust, saying, "I didn't do anything wrong, and you're lying." Sanchez repeats similar claims, questioning the validity of the charges. They speak loudly and refuse to comply with some of the officers' requests, contributing to a tense atmosphere inside the station. This continued verbal resistance shows that the incident did not end with the arrest but extended into the processing stage. The presence of additional officers is notable in this stage. They are tasked with ensuring the safety of both detainees, maintaining order, and completing the necessary paperwork and processing steps. The officers work to de-escalate tensions, asking both Perez and Sanchez to sit down and relax. However, the detainees remain loud and resistant, refusing to comply fully and continuing to question the officers' authority. This highlights the ongoing challenge police face in managing high-conflict arrests. The atmosphere inside the station remains charged. Voices are raised, and the detainees continue to demand explanations and protest their treatment. Officers work to complete the arrest documentation while managing these protests. They remind the detainees of their rights and explain the next steps in the process, including charges, potential court appearances, and the procedure for posting bail. Yet the detainees remain engaged in verbal confrontation rather than compliance. By the conclusion of this section, the formal arrest process is complete, but the aftermath of the incident lingers. Perez and Sanchez remain in custody, charged with multiple offenses arising from the incident. The officers document the encounter thoroughly, noting the resistance and behavior of both individuals. This documentation forms the basis of the charges and the legal proceedings that will follow. The incident leaves an impression of a sustained conflict that began in the backyard and continued throughout transport and processing. The aftermath also includes the public dimension of the incident. Bystanders and those involved continue to discuss and dispute what happened, reflecting the controversy and mistrust that can accompany high-conflict arrests. Both Perez and Sanchez have made their objections clear, not only to the officers but also to those around them. This public dispute underscores the broader issues of communication, compliance, and perception in such encounters. Finally, Section 4 reflects on the broader implications of the incident. What began as a noise complaint escalated into a multi-officer arrest involving physical resistance, verbal confrontation, and a prolonged processing stage. The charges filed against Perez and Sanchez highlight the consequences of resisting arrest and engaging in disorderly conduct. The incident provides a clear example of how quickly tensions can escalate in police encounters, and how the aftermath can extend beyond the arrest itself. By the end of Section 4, the narrative of the encounter comes to a close. Perez and Sanchez are formally charged and in custody, but the conflict, mistrust, and questions about proportionality and procedure remain. The incident stands as a detailed example of the complexity of arrest situations, illustrating how initial encounters can spiral into sustained confrontations, with lasting consequences for all parties involved.